Diane Foster had spent months tethered to the sterile world of hospital walls, fighting for her health with a determination born of love and a stubborn refusal to let go of life's important moments. When her son, Evan, passed the bar exam, she made a decision that doctors called reckless, but Diane knew was necessary. She would be there, no matter what it cost her. She left her hospital bed against medical advice, dressed carefully in borrowed strength and hope, and made her way to the grand party thrown in Evan's honor. She sat quietly among the glittering crowd, pride and exhaustion warring within her. But when Evan stood up to thank those who had carried him to this milestone, Diane listened in stunned silence as her name was never spoken. In that hollow, aching moment, she realized that sometimes the deepest sacrifices are the ones no one ever sees, and that true love must find a way to survive even the loneliest silences. Diane Foster had never been the kind of woman who sought attention. Her life was stitched together from small, unnoticed acts of devotion. The early mornings packing lunches, the late nights sewing buttons back onto worn shirts, the endless sacrifices that no one ever asked for, but everyone seemed to expect. She had raised Evan largely on her own after her husband, Mark, left when Evan was still in elementary school, drawn to a different life, a different family. Diane never spoke badly of him. She simply folded her heart a little smaller, packed Evan's backpack with extra sandwiches, and found ways to stretch a cashier's paycheck across endless bills. Their little house in Eastbrook wasn't much, but it was warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and always filled with the comforting smells of fresh bread and the faint tang of lemon polish. She poured everything she had into Evan. From the beginning, he showed a sharp mind, a knack for argument and analysis that made her heart swell with pride. She worked overtime when she could, skipped new shoes for herself more times than she could count, and spent evenings hunched over secondhand textbooks trying to help him with homework that soon outpaced her understanding. When Evan won a scholarship to a prestigious university, Diane cried in the privacy of her tiny bathroom, clutching the acceptance letter to her chest, rocking slightly as the realization sank in that all the late nights and quiet prayers had somehow, miraculously, been enough. Life wasn't kind to Diane's health, though. Years of stress and too little self-care caught up with her, culminating in a series of hospital stays that left her body frail and her future uncertain. She was in the hospital again when Evan called with the news. He had passed the bar exam on his first try. Diane pressed the phone tightly to her ear, her eyes filling with tears as she listened to Evan's excited voice. He spoke quickly, rattling off plans for a celebration party his mentor was throwing, a gathering full of law partners, professors, and old classmates. Diane smiled and told him how proud she was, masking the sudden pang of fear that gripped her. She was hooked up to monitors, tied down by IVs, her body a betrayal she could no longer command easily. But there was never a question in her mind. She had to be there. She spoke with her doctors, who shook their heads, advised caution, warned her that the exertion might set back her fragile recovery. Diane listened politely, nodded when appropriate, and then quietly arranged a day pass for a few precious hours. She sat up in bed for the first time in days, wincing at the stiffness in her joints, and slowly, painfully, dressed herself in the simple navy dress she had packed in the small hospital closet weeks before, just in case. The taxi driver who picked her up didn't know what to make of the pale, frail woman clutching a hospital-issued cane and a paper-thin purse. Diane simply smiled at him, gave him the address of the country club where the party was being held, and stared out the window during the ride, feeling the world rush past her in a blur of colors she hadn't seen for weeks. She smoothed her dress again and again in her lap, willing her body to cooperate, willing the exhaustion back into the dark corners of her mind where it couldn't ruin this night. When she arrived, she paused outside the grand entrance, gathering her strength. The doors opened onto a room ablaze with light and laughter, a sea of well-dressed people with sparkling glasses and practiced smiles. Diane stepped inside, unnoticed at first, her small frame swallowed by the glamour of it all. She spotted Evan almost immediately, tall, handsome, his arm around a young woman Diane hadn't met before, his face lit up with pride and promise. He saw her then, and his face broke into a broad smile. "Mom! You made it!" he said, weaving through the crowd to embrace her. His arms were strong, steady, and for a brief, beautiful moment, Diane allowed herself to believe that everything had been worth it. "You look wonderful," she said, brushing invisible lint from his jacket, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I'm so glad you're here," Evan said. "It means a lot, really." He led her to a table near the back, fussed over her a little, introduced her quickly to a few classmates whose names she immediately forgot. Diane smiled, nodded, laughed when appropriate, her body screaming for rest even as her heart drank, in every detail, storing it away to savor later when the loneliness crept back in. The speeches began after dinner. Evan's mentor spoke first, recounting stories of Evan's sharp mind and relentless drive. Evan's professors stood and offered congratulations, anecdotes of late-night study sessions and courtroom simulations. Finally, Evan stood, glass in hand, commanding the room's attention with the easy confidence Diane had always known was inside him. He spoke about hard work, about late nights and early mornings, about mentors who had shaped him and friends who had supported him. He thanked his professors, his classmates, and his colleagues. He even mentioned his father, Mark, thanking him for teaching him the importance of perseverance. Diane sat up a little straighter, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting. For her moment, the simple acknowledgement that would make every sleepless night and sacrificed dream feel seen. But it never came. As Evan lowered his glass to a chorus of applause, Diane sat frozen in her chair, a soft, stunned smile still fixed on her face. The world around her blurred and buzzed with noise, but inside her chest, there was only a vast, aching silence. After the speeches, the party roared back to life, the room vibrating with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of congratulatory chatter. Diane sat quietly at her table, feeling the world move past her like a river she was no longer part of. Evan had returned to his group of friends, his head thrown back in laughter as he accepted handshakes and slaps on the back. For a few moments, Diane simply watched him, pride and pain warring quietly within her chest. He looked happy, confident, everything she had ever wished for him. She wanted that for him. She had spent decades wanting that for him. But she hadn't realized how invisible she would feel standing just outside the edges of his bright, shining future. A young woman with a tray of champagne flutes paused at Diane's table, offering a drink with a distracted smile. Diane shook her head gently, lifting her cup of water instead. It tasted like paper and regret. She told herself not to be so sensitive, that Evan hadn't meant to forget her, that the whirlwind of the night had simply swept him away. She tried to focus on the positives, on the fact that he had smiled so brightly when he saw her, that he had hugged her with real warmth, that he had taken time to make sure she had a seat and a meal. But the small, wounded place inside her refused to be silenced. It whispered that she had been forgotten in the moment that should have mattered most. As the night wore on, Diane grew increasingly tired. The pain in her side, dulled by adrenaline earlier, had begun to pulse insistently, and the edges of her vision blurred whenever she moved too quickly. Still she stayed, forcing herself to sit upright, to smile when spoken to pretend she belonged among these polished strangers with their designer clothes and easy privilege. She didn't want Evan to look over and see her gone, didn't want him to feel abandoned the way she now felt. Eventually, Evan circled back to her table, breathless and flushed from dancing. "Mom, we're heading to the bar downtown," he said, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You okay to head out? I'll call you tomorrow, promise." Diane nodded, the smile still plastered to her face. "Of course, sweetheart. Go have fun. You deserve it." He kissed her cheek in a quick, distracted way, already half-turned toward the door. She watched him leave, his tall figure disappearing into the crowd without a backward glance. Left alone, Diane sat for a few more minutes, gathering the strength to stand. Her legs trembled as she made her way slowly toward the exit, the festive lights and music spinning dizzily around her. Outside, the cool night air slapped her cheeks, and she breathed deeply, trying to steady herself. The taxi she had arranged earlier waited at the curb, the driver leaning casually against the hood, checking his phone. He opened the door wordlessly as she approached, and Diane slid inside with a soft, exhausted sigh. The ride back to the hospital was quiet. Diane leaned, her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light. She thought about all the milestones she had witnessed: first steps, first words, scraped knees, science fairs, heartbreaks, triumphs. She had been there for all of it, a constant, quiet force anchoring Evan's world. And now, in this gleaming city where he would build a future she had once only dared to dream for him, she had become invisible. When the taxi pulled up to the hospital entrance, Diane paid the fare and thanked the driver. She made her way slowly back inside, the fluorescent lights glaring too brightly against her weary eyes. The nurses greeted her with gentle smiles, asking if she needed anything, but Diane waved them off with a soft shake of her head. She returned to her room, the familiar scent of antiseptic welcoming her back like a sigh. Alone in the sterile room, Diane changed back into her hospital gown with trembling hands. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the dark window, her reflection faint and blurred against the city lights beyond. She had fought so hard to be part of Evan's moment, to stand witness to the future she had sacrificed so much to build. But as she slipped beneath the thin hospital blanket, pulling it up to her chin, she realized that some kinds of love were destined to be quiet, unseen, carried in the secret spaces of a mother's heart where no one could ever truly understand the weight of it. The following days at the hospital blurred together in a quiet haze of routine. Nurses came and went, monitors beeped steadily, and the meals arrived with predictable blandness. Diane found herself slipping into a rhythm she knew too well, one of waiting for strength to return, waiting for visitors who might not come, waiting for the next small reminder that the life she had once shaped so carefully now moved on without her. She told herself not to be bitter. She had never given her love with the expectation of payment. She had chosen motherhood knowing full well that sacrifices often went unnoticed. And yet, the silence weighed on her more heavily now, pressing down with a force she had not anticipated. Evan did call 2 days after the party. His voice was cheerful, casual, full of news about his new internship, the downtown apartment he was moving into with 2 friends, the excitement of starting his adult life. Diane clutched the phone tightly, listening to every word, inserting small congratulations at the appropriate moments, her heart aching with a complicated mix of pride and sadness. He didn't mention the party, didn't apologize for the forgotten speech, didn't seem to sense that anything had been amiss. It wasn't malice, she understood. It was obliviousness, the casual, cruel sort that youth so often wielded without realizing the cuts it left behind. After the call ended, Diane lay back against the stiff hospital pillows, staring at the ceiling tiles until they blurred together. She thought about all the times she had stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays, about the early mornings spent on cold bleachers at soccer games, the endless meetings with teachers, the nights she had sat up worrying when Evan was late coming home. All of it had been done without expectation, yes, but also with the quiet hope that she would remain an anchor in his life, that she would be remembered not just in passing, but as a central figure. To be reduced to a background character in her own son's triumph hurt more than she dared to admit, even to herself. The hospital released her a week later. Her body was still weak, but there was no reason to keep her under observation any longer. She returned home to her small, neat house, the silence there somehow louder than the constant beeping and shuffling of the hospital. The bed was cold and too big. The living room, usually filled with Evan's laughter during his boyhood, now echoed hollowly around her. She moved slowly through the rooms, touching familiar objects: the worn Afghan on the sofa, the framed photos on the mantel, the faded growth chart penciled into the kitchen doorway. Evidence of a life once full, now receding like a low tide, leaving behind forgotten shells. Days turned into weeks. Evan's calls grew more sporadic, each one shorter than the last. He was busy, he explained. Work was demanding, networking events piled up, new friends filled his weekends. Diane understood. She told herself she was lucky that he was thriving, that she had succeeded in preparing him for this life, even if it meant there was no longer room for her in it. But understanding didn't soften the ache of absence. The worst moments came not when the phone failed to ring, but when it did. When neighbors or old friends called to ask how Evan was doing, to marvel at his success, to praise her for raising such a fine young man. Diane smiled and agreed, her voice warm and proud, while her heart hollowed out a little more with each word. She never mentioned the hospital, the party, the forgotten speech. She locked those hurts away where they could not shame or embarrass her, where they could not taint the narrative that everyone else seemed so eager to believe. In the quiet hours of the night, when the house creaked and settled around her, Diane often sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands. She would think back over the years, measuring and remembering her choices, wondering where she had gone wrong. But deep down, she knew she hadn't. Love was never wasted, even when it went unseen. The work of mothering, of building someone else's future at the cost of your own comfort, was sacred even when it was silent. Still, the loneliness was real. It settled in her chest like a second heartbeat, constant and aching. She began filling her days with small routines, tending the garden, volunteering at the library, attending Sunday service without fail. She found solace in the slow, steady kindness of a life lived with quiet dignity. She smiled at the children, in town, handed out hymn books at church, helped shelve donated books without anyone needing to ask. In time, Diane began to realize that her worth was not tied to how loudly someone spoke her name at a party, or how often she was called from a busy city. It lived in the invisible things, in the lessons she had taught, in the compassion she had modeled, in the resilience she had passed down without fanfare. She had been the soil Evan had grown from, and whether or not he ever fully understood it, she had been the foundation beneath his feet all along. The winter that followed was long and unkind, the kind of winter that seeped into your bones and made even the simplest tasks feel heavy. Diane moved through the gray days with the quiet steadiness of someone who had long ago accepted that not every season was meant for blooming. She filled her hours with small acts of care, knitting scarves for the church's charity drive, baking loaves of bread for the local food pantry, shoveling her own walkway in slow, careful swipes of the shovel. Outside, the world seemed wrapped in silence, the snow muffling even the hum of traffic. And inside, Diane matched that silence with her own. In the evenings, she sometimes found herself sitting by the fire with her knitting needles idle in her lap, her thoughts drifting back to Evan with a tenderness that surprised her. She imagined him rushing from meeting to meeting in his crisp suits, his phone pressed to his ear, his life unfolding in the bright lights of the city far beyond her little world. She no longer allowed herself to dwell on the night of the party or the missed mentions. Those wounds had scarred over, tender but no longer raw. Instead, she thought of the boy he had been, the boy who had run to her with scraped knees and fevered dreams, the boy who had whispered, "I love you, Mom," into her ear when he thought no one else could hear. That boy was still part of the man he had become, even if the years and the distance had blurred the connection. There were days when the ache of it rose unexpectedly, a familiar song on the radio, a neighbor's grandchild waving from a car seat, the smell of new leather. When she passed the town's tiny shoe shop, The ache was a reminder of everything she had given, of the life she had built around someone else's dreams. And yet, it was also a reminder that she had been capable of that kind of love, the kind that plants itself deeply and endures even when the winds of change strip the branches bare. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, Diane came across a faded folder filled with Evan's childhood drawings. Stick-figure families with smiling faces, lopsided houses, with smoke curling from the chimneys, tiny handprints pressed into construction paper hearts. She sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the cold seeping through her jeans, and flipped through the pages with a kind of reverence. In every picture, she was there, sometimes holding Evan's hand, sometimes standing behind him, sometimes simply smiling from the background. He had drawn her into his world without even thinking about it, because back then her presence had been as certain and essential as the ground beneath his feet. It was enough, Diane realized, to have been that foundation, even if time and success had shifted the view. The love she had poured into Evan had not vanished. It had simply changed shape, woven into the fabric of the person he had become. It was in the steady way he faced challenges, in the kindness he showed to others, even if that kindness sometimes stumbled when it came back to her. She closed the folder carefully and placed it back into the box, her hands steady. Love, she understood now, was not always returned in the ways you hoped. Sometimes it went unnoticed, unthanked, unspoken. But that didn't diminish its worth. It lived on in the silent spaces between words, in the unseen hands that steady a life long after the memory of their touch has faded. As the first hints of spring began to break through the frozen ground, small, stubborn crocuses pushing their way toward the pale sun, Diane allowed herself to hope. Not for grand gestures or tearful reunions, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had done the work of love well and fully. Whatever recognition had been withheld, whatever words had been left unspoken, she carried something more enduring within her. The knowledge that she had loved completely, without condition, without guarantee, and that in doing so, she had lived a life of rare and unshakable grace. As the days grew longer and the thaw of spring seeped into the ground, Diane found herself moving with a little more ease. The heavy coat of winter, both literal and emotional, began to slip from her shoulders. She filled her days with small, deliberate joys. She planted rows of daisies and marigolds in the backyard, their bright faces reaching toward the soft April sun. She accepted an invitation to join a reading group at the town library, where she discovered a camaraderie she hadn't realized she missed. She began attending Wednesday night dinners at the church, bringing her homemade rolls that were quickly devoured and praised. The kindness of small communities, the simple rhythm of caring and being cared for, stitched itself around her like a quilt, offering comfort without grand promises. It was during one of those library afternoons that Diane met Helen, a retired teacher with a quick wit and a ready laugh. Helen had her own stories of family growing distant, of sacrifices unnoticed and gratitude delayed. Over countless cups of coffee and dog-eared novels passed between them, a quiet friendship bloomed. It was the kind of companionship that didn't demand explanations or apologies. It simply existed, steady and real, a shared understanding that the deepest loves were often the ones most easily overlooked by the very people they had nurtured. One Saturday morning, as Diane knelt by her flower beds, pulling weeds with methodical patience, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She wiped her hands on her jeans and answered, her heart lifting when she saw Evan's name flash on the screen. His voice was breathless, rushed, the city sounds bustling in the background. He was checking in, he said, feeling guilty for being so busy. He mentioned a new case he was working on, a client who reminded him of the people in Eastbrook, the way they valued honesty and kindness over flashy success. "You were right about a lot of things, Mom," he said, and though the words were tossed casually into the conversation, Diane felt their weight. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun soaked into her skin, and smiled. They spoke for 20 minutes, longer than they had in months. Evan promised to visit in a few weeks once his schedule lightened. Diane didn't cling to the promise the way she once might have. She understood now that life pulled people in different directions, that love wasn't measured by proximity or even constant attention. She tucked his words into her heart like a smooth stone, something solid and real to hold on to, but not something she needed to survive. When she hung up, she looked around her small, blooming world with a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. Her garden wasn't perfect. There were bare patches where seeds hadn't taken, stubborn weeds that refused to be tamed. But it was alive, stubbornly, beautifully alive. And so was she. The following Sunday, at the church potluck, Diane was asked to share a few words about her volunteer work. She stood at the podium, hands steady, and spoke not about herself, but about community, about the small ways we carry one another through quiet acts of service. She looked out at the familiar faces, the librarian who always saved her favorite books, the neighbor who shoveled her walkway without being asked, the children who waved from the playground, and felt a profound sense of belonging. She had been so focused on what she had lost that she had almost missed what she had gained. A community that valued her not for her titles, not for her sacrifices, but simply for her presence. Afterward, as she helped stack chairs and wipe down tables, a young mother she barely knew approached her. "My little girl loves seeing you at the library," she said, smiling warmly. "She calls you the nice lady who always smiles. You've made a difference to her." Diane blinked back unexpected tears, touched by the simple, genuine kindness. She realized then that legacy wasn't always about grand speeches or public recognition. Sometimes it was about the tiny ripples of kindness left in the wake of a life lived with open hands and an open heart. That night, sitting on her porch with the stars bright above her and the scent of fresh earth all around, Diane finally let go of the lingering sadness that had clung to her since the night of Evan's celebration. She understood now that her love had never been invisible, not really. It had simply taken root in places she couldn't always see. In Evan's steady kindness with his clients, in the laughter of a child at the library, in the warm embraces of her neighbors, in her own steady, unbreakable heart. She had stepped out of her hospital bed believing that her worth was tied to whether or not she was named, acknowledged, thanked. But standing under the vast, forgiving sky, Diane knew better now. Her worth had always been stitched into every sacrifice, every whispered prayer, every quiet act of devotion she had ever offered. Recognition was fleeting. Gratitude was often late. But love, the real kind, left a mark that no speech, no party, no oversight could ever erase. The early days of summer were kind to Diane, filling her life with sunlight, neighbors' laughter, and small, hard-won joys. Her days had taken on a steady rhythm, and though Evan's promised visit kept getting pushed further out with each new call, Diane bore it with patience. She told herself he was young, building a demanding career, carving out a place for himself in a world that required endless energy and sacrifice. She smiled through their brief conversations, offering encouragement, never letting her voice betray the sting she sometimes felt when another weekend passed without the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. But as June bled into July, a new wound opened, unexpected and sharper than anything that had come before. Diane was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of mail, when a crisp white envelope caught her attention. It was addressed in Evan's handwriting, which still had the slight forward tilt she remembered from his school days. Her heart lifted for a moment, foolishly imagining a handwritten letter, maybe even a small note of appreciation or love. But when she opened it, a formal printed card slid out, a save the date for Evan's engagement party. She stared at it for a long moment, the words blurring. Evan was engaged. To the young woman Diane had met so briefly at the law party, the one with perfect hair and a polished laugh. There was no letter enclosed, no personal note, just the impersonal announcement and a sleek insert about hotels and parking. Diane sat back in her chair, the breath leaving her in a slow, silent exhale. She should have been happy. It was good news. This was what she had worked for, sacrificed for, to see Evan build a life filled with success and love. But beneath the surface, a deep loneliness bloomed. Another milestone was arriving, another celebration gathering at the horizon. And she was not at the center of it. She wasn't even sure if she would have a real place at all. In the weeks leading up to the engagement party, Diane wrestled with her heart. She bought a new dress, simple but elegant, the kind her mother would have, called proper. She rehearsed small talk in the mirror, the questions and congratulations she might offer to Evan's fiancé's parents, to Evan's friends and colleagues. She practiced masking the small aches that still lingered from the last gathering, telling herself this time would be different. The day of the party arrived in a heavy, humid haze. Diane drove herself to the venue, a sprawling country club draped in gauzy decorations and fresh flowers. The valet took her aging sedan without judgment, and she smoothed her dress before stepping inside. The room was already filled with guests, young, polished people laughing easily, older couples exchanging pleasantries over glasses of champagne. She spotted Evan across the room almost immediately, tall and radiant with success, his fiancée clinging to his arm. He caught sight of Diane and waved, smiling brightly. She smiled back, her heart lifting slightly. Maybe, just maybe, this day would hold something different. For a while, it did. Evan introduced her warmly to a few people, and Diane exchanged polite greetings, her heart swelling with cautious pride. She stood quietly through the toasts and speeches, applauding when appropriate, laughing when expected. She watched Evan beam at his bride-to-be, and she let herself hope that perhaps her place, though modest, would be honored. Then came the final speech, Evan's words of gratitude to everyone who had helped him along the way. He thanked his fiancée for her support, her parents for their generosity, his mentors, his friends. He even paused to acknowledge the importance of family, mentioning his late father with a kind of polished sorrow that barely masked the years of abandonment. But Diane's name, her story, her sacrifices, her presence, went unspoken again. She stood there applauding with the rest, her heart hollow but her smile steady. She could not crumble. Not here. Not where every glance and every whisper might carry judgment. She had no strength left to counter. When the speeches ended and the music swelled through the bright floral-draped hall, Diane made her way quietly toward the exit. She did not want Evan to see her leave, did not want her absence to become a burden he might carry reluctantly. She left as she had lived for so many years, quietly, with grace, without demands. Outside, the evening was cooler, the heavy heat of the day beginning to lift. Diane stood for a moment by the edge of the parking lot, the country club glowing behind her like a world she had never truly belonged to. She slipped off her heels, carrying them in one hand, and walked barefoot across the cool grass toward her car, feeling the earth solid beneath her aching feet. The drive home was silent, but not sorrowful. Diane understood now that some doors would never open for her, no matter how much love she had poured behind them. Some recognitions would never be spoken, no matter how deserving. And some people, no matter how deeply they were loved, would never fully comprehend the cost of the foundation they had been given to build their lives upon. But Diane also knew something deeper, something stronger. Her life was not diminished by their forgetting. Her worth was not measured by their acknowledgement. She had loved bravely. She had given without counting the cost. And in doing so, she had built something no oversight could erase. As the stars appeared one by one in the night sky, Diane drove home with the windows down, the cool wind lifting her hair, her heart a little sore, but still, somehow, full. The days after the engagement party passed with a peculiar quietness. Diane returned to her routines, watering her garden, helping at the library, exchanging brief, friendly conversations with neighbors. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, something had settled in her, a deep, unshakable understanding that she could no longer measure her life through the eyes of others, not even Evan's. She had done her part. She had fulfilled her promises, both spoken and unspoken. And now, whatever recognition or gratitude came or didn't come would no longer define her. Still, there were moments when the ache caught her by surprise. Folding a towel that Evan used to drag behind him as a cape, passing the playground where she used to sit for hours, watching him climb and fall and rise again, walking through the grocery store and spotting Evan's favorite cereal, the one she used to save coupons for when money was tight. Love, she realized, leaves traces everywhere, long after the ones we love have moved on. One evening, as Diane was pruning the wild tangle of roses in her backyard, her phone rang. She wiped her hands on her jeans and answered, her heart lifting when she saw Evan's name. His voice was warm but rushed, filled with the excited chaos of wedding planning. He asked if she might help with some family arrangements, perhaps recommend a caterer from town, maybe help coordinate a few distant relatives. Diane listened, her heart twisting slightly. He wasn't asking for her to be honored. He was asking for her to help, quietly and efficiently, just as she always had. For a moment she hesitated, the pruning shears trembling lightly in her hand. She could say no. She could step back fully, protect the tender places that still hurt. But something deeper in her, something rooted in the same soil that had carried her through all these years, made her smile into the phone and say, "Of course, Evan, I'll do whatever you need." Because that was who she was, not because she was unseen. Not because she was obligated, but because love, real love, continued even when it wasn't acknowledged in speeches or photographs. It was a choice she made, again and again, not because she had to, but because it was part of her very being. After she hung up, Diane sat on the back steps, watching the last light of day soften into twilight. She thought about all the choices she had made, the paths she had taken that no one else had seen. She thought about the way Evan had grown strong and steady, even if he did not always recognize the hands that had steadied him. And she thought about herself, not as a footnote, not as a background character, but as a woman who had loved courageously, who had given her life in small, countless ways that no speech could ever fully capture. That night, Diane pulled out an old journal she hadn't written in for years. She opened to a fresh page and began to write, not letters to Evan, not stories, for anyone else's eyes, but reflections for herself. She wrote about the garden she had planted and the life she had tended, about the strength it took to raise a child alone, about the quiet victories no one ever celebrated, but that mattered. Just the same. As the ink flowed across the page, Diane felt something loosen in her chest, a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She didn't need an audience. She didn't need applause. She needed only to know, deep in the marrow of her bones, that she had lived her life with courage, with kindness, with steadfast, unshakable love, and that was enough. The weeks rolled by, and summer deepened into its richest colors. Diane moved through her days with a calm acceptance, no longer chasing acknowledgement, no longer aching for recognition that might never come. She busied herself with preparations for Evan's wedding, helping where she could, offering advice when asked, always stepping back gracefully when she wasn't needed. It was a dance she knew well, being present but invisible, giving without expectation of thanks. When the wedding day arrived, it was beautiful in the way that weddings often are. Evan looked handsome in his tailored suit, his bride radiant in a gown of shimmering white. The country club lawn where they exchanged their vows was wrapped in flowers and laughter, the sky above impossibly blue. Diane sat among the rows of guests, tucked a few seats back, not part of the immediate procession, but close enough to see Evan's nervous smile, to hear the catch in his voice when he promised. Forever. She wept quietly when they exchanged rings, her heart swelling with pride and a bittersweet sorrow she had long since accepted. No one called her forward for special photographs. No one singled her out during the toasts. But Diane did not falter. She clapped when the speeches ended, raised her glass during the first dance, and cheered softly as Evan spun his new wife across the dance floor. Later, as the sun set in a blaze of gold behind the hills, Diane wandered toward the edge of the lawn, where the noise of the party faded into the soft hum of evening crickets. She stood quietly, arms folded loosely across her chest, breathing. In the cool night air. She had made peace with this, she realized. She did not need to stand in the center of Evan's life to know she had helped build the path that brought him here. Her fingerprints were on every step, every success, whether anyone else saw them or not. As she watched the newlyweds laugh, together under the string lights, Diane felt no resentment, only gratitude. Gratitude that Evan had found happiness, gratitude that she had been strong enough to love without needing to possess, to give without demanding anything in return. That, she thought, was a different kind of strength, one not celebrated in speeches or written into history books, but a strength that mattered all the same. When the evening wound down and the crowd began to drift away, Evan found her sitting, quietly near the rose garden. He hugged her tightly, whispering, "Thank you for everything, Mom." Just 6 words, hurried, almost casual, but they were enough. Diane smiled, pressing a hand briefly to his cheek, feeling the stubble of a boy she had once carried on her hip. She stayed only a little longer, slipping away before the last songs played, before the cleanup began. She drove home slowly, the K, warm summer night wrapping around her like a soft, familiar blanket. The house greeted her with its familiar creaks and the scent of lavender she had tucked into bowls on the windowsills. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Diane caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She looked tired, yes, but there was something steadier in her gaze now, something quietly victorious. She had given everything she could. She had loved without limit, and she had found her way back to herself, whole and unbroken. In the quiet weeks that followed the wedding, Diane allowed herself the grace of slowing down. She spent long mornings tending to her garden, afternoons reading on the porch, evenings walking through town as the streetlights blinked awake one by one. There was a comfort in the simplicity, a healing that came not from grand gestures, but from the small, faithful rhythms of a life well lived. Sometimes, she would catch herself thinking back to Evan's childhood, the scraped knees, the whispered bedtime fears, the joyful chaos of birthday mornings. Those memories lived inside her like well-worn stones, smooth and comforting to the touch. She understood now that those moments had been enough. They didn't need to be commemorated in speeches or displayed in photographs to matter. Their value had always been intrinsic, stitched into the fabric of her life in ways that no one else's recognition could enhance or diminish. There were still pangs of sadness, moments when the emptiness caught her off guard. A quiet Sunday afternoon. A song from years past drifting through a shop doorway. A photograph of a mother and son laughing together, untouched by distance or time. But Diane no longer let those moments define her. She acknowledged them gently and then let them pass, much like autumn winds moving through the tall grasses by the river. One afternoon, while organizing old boxes in the attic, Diane found a crumpled piece of paper tucked between 2 photo albums. It was a school project Evan had done in 2nd grade, a simple drawing of a stick figure woman with wild hair holding hands with a little boy. Above it, in bold, crooked letters, Evan had written, "My mom is my hero." Diane traced the words with her fingertips, a soft smile curving her lips. He had seen her then, before the noise of the world and the demands of adulthood crowded out those simple truths. That was enough for her. It had always been enough. She framed the drawing and placed it on the wall beside her favorite window, where the light of each new day could fall across it. Not as a shrine to what had been lost, but as a quiet reminder of what would always endure. The love she had given, the sacrifices she had made, the life she had built, they were not invisible. They were part of the foundation upon which new futures would be built long after her own story faded from the forefront. As the season shifted once more and the first hints of autumn colored the trees, Diane Foster stood steady in her small, beloved life. She had loved without limits. She had given without keeping score. And in the end, she had found a peace that no forgotten speech, no overlooked invitation could ever take away. She had lived her life with open hands and an open heart, and that, she knew now with quiet certainty, had always been more than enough. If Diane's story spoke to something deep within you, share it with someone who believes that true love is measured not by public recognition, but by the quiet, enduring sacrifices that shape our lives. Subscribe for more emotional journeys that honor resilience, devotion, and the invisible victories that deserve to be celebrated. Thank you for being part of a community that sees the beauty in ordinary heroes and the strength it takes to love without condition.